Well, first, I'm amazed to see you all here. I figured everybody is so sick and tired of it all. You're just going to hide. Second, there is no way that I can cheer you up. Third, if I did cheer you up, I'd have to talk about a different subject. You know, the San Francisco Ballet, the opera, things. What I want to do today is actually probably unexpected, and that is I don't want to talk about the details of various policies, although at the end, if you want to ask questions about anything, I'm happy to have you ask questions about anything. I want to sort of contextualize what's going on a little bit. And then next time, I'll address specific policies, issues in more depth. But as I said, based on whatever I say, feel free to ask questions about, God knows, Ukraine. John is itching to talk about the Ukraine, and other subjects. But I want to speak more broadly first. You will recall, for those of you who are regulars, that I said that students of international affairs and historians tend to talk about international systems, eras, if you will. And the systems are times in which there are enough similarities, the processes, the actors, and so forth, sort of seem similar. And generally speaking, the best way to know when there is a stretch or there is a system is after it's taken place, right? You look in retrospect and you say, this was the so-and-so system. So, for example, people talk about the long 19th century, and the reason they go up until World War I is substantially until World War I, the world sort of looked fairly similar. And then World War I came along, and then you have World War I, and then you had the interwar period, fascism arose and the rest of it. Then you had the Second World War, then you had the Cold War, which sort of ended, let's say, 1990, give or take. And then what? Various things happened in the 1990s, and I want to talk a couple of minutes about that. But then you moved into the 21st century, and people are now beginning to talk about the 21st century system. Actually, well, we won't know whether that's right or wrong until, let's say, 2050, but in any event, people are trying to say there are new things afoot, and they're different than they were in the 20th century. So one of the things that we know, and I'm just rehearsing things we've talked about before, is that after the Second World War, you had a number, not immediately the day after, but you had a number of things. You had the U.S. coming out victorious, right, and its allies. You had, in due course, the Soviet Union being its opposition, the Cold War. You had the end of colonialism, because by the time you got to the mid-1970s, most countries in the world had been decolonized. You had the presence of nuclear weapons. And you had the notion that people ought to look at the earlier part of the 20th century to see what went wrong, so as not to repeat it. And one of the things that was perceived to be having gotten wrong was nationalism. And nationalism, under certain circumstances, then moved into fascism and so forth. And so part of the international structure, which people are now talking about being changed, eroded, whatever, was the building of institutions which minimized the role of nationalism and maximized the role of internationalism. And so you had the development of all kinds of institutions which were meant to address collective, interdependent, international issues and erode or undermine the sense of national identities. So on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, there was the sense in the West, under US leadership and others, to somehow control the Soviet Union in one fashion or another. So that gets fairly complex, and without boring you with, going through all the details again, which I've done to some extent in the past, let's say that the entire UN system was meant to, in a sense, internationalize the affairs of very many aspects of state interaction. The membership of the UN were states. So the UN did not try to get rid of states, but rather to find ways for states to cooperate politically in the UN in New York, but also to cooperate on various subject matters. For example, world health, eventually nuclear matters, food and agriculture. There are these endless UN agencies, which either you or your children saw on maps. There's the UN, and then there are all these vehicles out there. And they had, from the perspective of the US at least, they had two purposes. One was, again, to undermine nationalism and to create a sense of interdependence, but also to rebuild the world that was destroyed in the Second World War, so that, because their fear was after the Second World War, if European countries continued to be poor, they would be very open to communism. And as I've mentioned before, in Italy and France, after the Second World War, communist parties were very strong, and there was the real fear that communism might take hold through elections, but then take hold in those countries, right? So for economic reasons, political reasons, and so forth, the idea was that the UN system as a set of international institutions would help stabilize the world economically, politically, socially, and so forth. Then there was the idea that you could and you should address Europe by itself as a region. And the idea arose that you should have a common market in Europe, which eventually led to what we now have, the European Union, right? And that was, in some extent, on the part of the US, again, thought about as inoculation against communism, that is to say, helping to rebuild Europe and sharing it. But there were other ideas behind it, and one of them was that in the modern world, the second half of the century, small states wouldn't fare very well. And therefore, interlinking the economic and transportation and scientific research and so forth amongst smaller countries would make the whole area more viable and more affluent, rather than having each country go alone. So you had the development, contrary to what Trump says, that the EU was developed in order to oppose the American economy. The support originally on the part of the United States for the EU was really to knit Western Europe into a single whole of one, and for all the purposes I just mentioned. Then eventually you had the development of Nato, North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. And that was an idea of developing military and institutional cooperation amongst Europe, but also not just Europe, because, for example, the United States and Canada and Turkey, for that matter, became members of NATO, a military alliance which stood in opposition to the military alliance of the Soviet Union, right? And the important part, which you've heard more often than you care to remember in the last few weeks, was that the alliance said that anybody who was attacked, everybody else would be obliged to respond. And that was meant to be a deterrent for an attack on anybody's part. Because if everybody knows that if you move into somebody else's terrain, you have some military action, everyone, including the United States, will come to defend you. It serves as a deterrent against conflict and violence amongst the members. Ironically, and you've heard this on the news, no doubt, over and over again, the one time the clause in the NATO was invoked that an attack on one would be an attack on all was 9/11. So it was on behalf of the United States, which is ironic considering how these things are talked about nowadays. But in any event, it gave protection to lots of small countries. And as you moved into the 21st century, of course, other countries joined, the former, Estonia and Latvia and those countries which moved out of the Soviet orbit after the end of the Cold War, joined NATO. So NATO is a much bigger organization nowadays than it was when it started and just had a few members. The idea is that linking countries through various kinds of cooperative mechanism would be conducive both to fostering whatever subject matter those organizations dealt with, but also would foster development of cooperation among states and would undermine nationalism, was generally believed by more or less everybody. So what happens to an well, I should quickly say there was an attempt to emulate that in every part of the world. There are regional organizations in Central America, in Latin America, in West Africa, which, by the way, got intervened recently in Gambia to have the elected person actually be able to take office because the previous person didn't want to leave office. So something called ECOWAS, a West African organization, which also has military capacity, came to force that issue. But every part of the world, more or less, began to have regional organizations, sometimes with very narrow subject matter, banking, economics, whatever, sometimes with very broad kind of regional subject matter. Now, there was then a development of an international institutional structure. So then the question arises for the contemporary period, why then is there is the sort of nationalism rearing its head, and why did these institutions not manage to accomplish what they set out to accomplish? How come we now have a revisitation of nationalism and national fervor and so forth? That question is not easy to answer, actually. I mean, lots of people sort of say things on TV, but it's actually a pretty complicated question. So let me just sort of point to a few things. One of the problems of international institutions is they tend to get very bureaucratic, they tend to get very technical, and they tend to get very distant. So what do you know, sitting here in Santa Cruz, about the precise policies of the World Health Organization or the Food and Agriculture Organization? You kind of know it exists, and if you're well disposed to the UN and internationalism, you probably think favorably of it, but you don't really know what they're doing, right? Well, whether it's the University of California or whether it's the US government or whatever, bureaucracies become fairly boring, they become fairly routine. People don't understand exactly what they're doing. They begin to hire more people than they need. They begin to give them higher salaries than they need or deserve. And perfectly reasonable people, not just right-wing nutcases, perfectly reasonable people saying, why is my money being wasted on this? All right. So in Europe, which was the European Union, the most intimate of the regional institutions, the ones that worked well, people began to suspect, for example, in England, to some extent in France and so forth, that there were an awful lot of rules and regulations that they didn't like, which were promulgated by these organizations. What were they doing anyway? I mean, if I wanted to start producing beer somewhere, and then all of a sudden I found out the beer I wanted to produce, I couldn't produce because there were rules about the amount of hops and other things that had to go into the beer. And then I'm sitting in Holland and I want to start a new brand of chocolate, and I'm told that the EU rules tell me that I can't produce this chocolate because it has to have a certain percentage of cocoa and sugar and so forth. And pretty soon I get annoyed with all these rules and regulations. So as the sort of 90s, 80s, 90s, moved along, beginning of 21st century, there was a fair amount of unhappiness about some of the aspects of the European Union and its bureaucracy. But perhaps even more important than that was the fact that the European Union never completed its evolution as an organization. Because if you are going to homogenize various things in the economy and trade and rules and regulations and movement of people and so forth, you have to be able to have some economic control so that when you have economic dislocations, think Greece, think somewhere else, that there is a mechanism that deters the worst of these economic dislocations and has some kind of remedies. And one of the things the members of the European Union never came around to agree on was to have economic, banking, and political organizations which could enforce themselves on various states and rectify imbalances. So then you have all of a sudden, the world economy is bad for a reason. You have 28% unemployment in Spain, and you have a total mess in Greece, and Italy is limping along. And can the EU do something? No, not really, because they don't have the mechanisms and teeth to do that. The question is, why were those mechanisms and teeth not given to them? They weren't given to them because national politicians didn't want to hand over the power and the authority to this institution. So looked at it from the 21st century perspective, the development of the EU was kind of half-baked. It did some things, it did them extremely well, but it didn't complete the picture. And so when you got around to major global economic dislocation, people said, what the hell, this EU isn't doing us any good. In fact, to some extent, it's doing us some harm. So that is one kind of process that it seems to me took place. The second thing that took place was and it didn't happen overnight, but by the 21st century, you could see it more starkly, was a change in technology, which has us all affected in different ways. First, it has affected people in terms of employment and the kind of education they need to stay employed, which meant that a lot of people in lots of countries in Europe and the United States and elsewhere found themselves unemployed or underemployed or unhappy with their employment of one kind or another, because the various aspects that needed to be done nationally and internationally to make sure that humans adjusted to the technological generation weren't put into place, or they weren't put into place in many countries and many places. So you have that. The second aspect of the technological revolution is that contrary to the past and even most of the 20th century, nowadays we know everything that's going on within nanoseconds around the world. And that makes us feel everything is out of control and everything is really bad. And whether it's Trump's contemporary fake news or whether it's real news, notice, I don't know if you looked at the papers today, notice the Sweden business, right? Trump misspeaks, lies, whatever, about Sweden having race riots, which they didn't have. And Sweden has more immigrants per capita refugees than any other country in the world. But then the people in Sweden who are immigrants and who are unhappy and who feel alienated decide, well, if that's what they're talking about, let's have one. So yesterday they actually had some riots. So now Trump can come along and saying, gee whiz, see, I was speaking the truth. I was just off by a day, right? One can, sort of laugh at it, but the fact of the matter is everybody's psyche, including everybody's in this room, is affected by the fact that we know and we have access to not just a lot of information, but in some ways too much information. It can't be digested. And then we're open to suggestion. This is caused by X, this is caused by Y. I'll talk a lot more about immigration next time, but let me just say that a normal American sitting in his or her living room would be under the impression that immigrants to the United States and all these refugees, A, produce a lot of violent crime, B, take away jobs from people, and therefore all these white males out there are unemployed because of the immigrants, and C, absorb the resources of our tax dollars because they're all so needy. None of this is true. Absolutely none of it, right? But everybody has reason to believe that because that's what is on the TV every day, right? So there's lots of misinformation, much undigested information. So the technology revolution also has that aspect to it. Then you have things happening that were unanticipated even in the 20th century. One of the things that is happening is that you have the largest number of people moving around the world since the Second World War. Roughly speaking, 65 million people. That's the size of a reasonable sized country and much larger than most European countries are roaming around the world trying to find a new place to live of one kind or another. That is produced, it seems to me, by two things. One, which is a lot in the media, and that has to do with the wars and the instability, right? The Middle East and so forth. We all know the Syrian refugees and so forth. But the other aspect to it, which is less discussed, it has to do with climate change, which we also need to talk more about. Because the larger proportion of people drifting into Europe aren't in fact coming from the Middle East. Those are the largest proportion of refugees are coming from the Middle East. But migrants, which is the larger proportion of foreigners moving into Europe than refugees, are in fact coming from North Africa and West Africa. And the reason they're coming is not just because they don't like their governments. The reason they're coming is because these people live in villages which no longer can support them because of climate change. The agriculture is being decimated in areas that are proximate to deserts, right? So all these Malians and Niger, people from Niger and so forth, which are sitting in the street for those of you who travel in Rome and in every other place, these are not refugees in the sense of people fleeing from Syria. These are young adults, by and large, who figure there's no future for them. They can't make a living where their families come from in the rural areas. And if they move into the urban areas where unemployment is about 50%, their chances of getting anywhere is minimized, right? And I would say that even if you imagine a stabilization of some of the war zones, some of the war areas in, let's say, in the Middle East, the number of people who will be on the move in the 21st century is something we can't even imagine at this point, because people will just move en masse everywhere. And that, of course, is politically very destabilizing. So I think that the input into populism, which is what Trump is about, what Farage is about. Farage, by the way, is going to be on Fox News now as a permanent person. Wills is leaving and Farage is coming. The Le Pen and so forth. In Europe right now, you have a situation where populists are on the rise in France, in Holland, in Germany, in Norway, in England, and you can go on, in Italy, you can go on and on. In some of these countries, they actually have a possibility of winning. I mean, Le Pen could win. And a surprising country, when I just mentioned, is Norway. One wouldn't think. Okay. And so then the question is, why are Americans voting for Trump, a populist? Why are Europeans voting for a populist? And I don't claim to sort of say it's all the same, it's all identical. In each country, there are distinctive reasons, but there are also common reasons. There are common reasons which you would having to do with the things I just mentioned, the economy, technology, unemployment, unhappiness with overly bureaucratic governments and international institutions and so forth. But there is one aspect in the US which is different and which is surprising that it looks the same at the moment. And that has to do with refugees and new people, immigrants coming in. Because the US used to be totally different than Europe. Because in Europe, by and large, while they have had people from the colonies and so forth come in over time, and I'm not suggesting all European countries were homogeneous up until the 21st century, nevertheless, most of these countries, small countries, homogeneous population, homogeneous culture, not used to incorporate different people. So if you were Senegalese living in France, or you were Ghanaian living in Germany, or whatever, or Turk living in any of these countries, you might actually be treated well, and in fact treated better than we often treat newcomers in this country. But you could never become French or German or English or anything. You just couldn't. You'd be a citizen, your children are born there, but there was no way that Europeans mostly could conceptualize that a Ghanaian could be a German, even though he might have been born there. And what made us distinctive was that people in the second generation did become Americans, right? We are a racist country, we know that, but we allowed people to become Americans, right? And if you were from Haiti, you would become a black American and discriminated against as a black person, but you were still considered an American, right? If you were from Italy or Ireland or, wherever, you could integrate in one way or another. And the history of American immigration is that most people started intermarrying. So that 2 or 3 generations down, people might remember my great-grandmother came from here, my grandfather came from there. But, how did this manifest itself? Maybe a little bit in the family's favorite food, maybe a little bit around holiday times and so forth. But basically, people lost their languages. Many people changed their names to make them look more American. People intermarried and melded in. And the Europeans always looked at us, as did the Asians, I might say, because the same thing was true. You can't become Japanese looking like I am. I could have been born and raised in Japan. No one in Japan would say, this woman is Japanese. Even if I didn't speak English anymore and only spoke Japanese. Come on, you don't look Japanese. How can you be Japanese? So it's not just Europe, but I was talking about Europe for a moment. The fact of the matter is that when large numbers of people came, countries felt that their culture might be changing. Right? And the odd thing about it is that in countries like Scandinavian countries, which are very homogeneous and treated newcomers, refugees, and others extremely well, but they wouldn't ever be Swedish or Norwegian, right? In people's psyche, the population started reacting, and the reaction became populism. Let's purify our country. Let's get rid of these people. What are these people doing? We're nice Norway, Sweden, whatever. Who are they? They're trouble. So on the one hand, they treated people extremely well. Special schools, programs, job training, and so forth. But you're not going to become Swedish. You're not going to become Norwegian or German or whatever. So there they are, imagining the populations of these countries, that their national identity is eroding, and it's being buffered from all sides. That is, say, from the side of international institutions, from the side of new people coming in, and then you have an economic crisis, right? And you imagine these people are at fault. Somebody's got to be at fault. Who is at fault? Those people. Or our government officials who are letting those people in. Right? And a kind of psychology of being harassed, feeling defensive, wanting the old days to come back takes root, and it leads to populism both on the right and populism on the left. You can take your favorite populism. So that, of course, raises the question, why in the US, which has had such a different history of incorporating people? Well, we had the economic crisis. We have technological change, right? We have, God forbid, a black president. What in the world is going on here? We have all kinds of problems. They don't seem to be addressed very effectively. And so you got to blame somebody, right? And you blame the government on the one hand, and on the other hand, you also blame the government policies which are perpetuating the inequalities, the messes people get into. Let me stop here and say that both in Europe and the United States, the people that have voted mostly for the populists in small towns, fairly homogeneous towns, are not the places where the refugees actually live or the migrants live. The most liberal areas tend to be the big cities, London, New York, Paris, whatever, where the population is most varied and where people are not looking at these people and saying they're the cause of our problem. Right? I mentioned before when I talked about Brexit, even the economics that they're taking away our jobs and so forth has absolutely zip truth. Factories have closed, but they've closed because of technology by and large, right? And where they exist in small towns, they're usually foreign investors, right? European car companies in England or whatever, or Japanese car companies in England. And most European populists, right and left, have no idea to what extent the schools in their countries, some of the cultural aspects of their countries, were in fact being paid by the European Union rather than their national government. It's one of the ironies of the situation, right? Ditto in the United States. There is zip evidence that these foreigners who are coming in, refugees, the bad people from Mexico, criminals, whatnot, none of that is actually demonstrably true. Only 1% of any crime is committed calculated by capita by any kind of refugee or migrant. In small towns in the U.S., upstate New York is a very good example here. You had towns that are absolutely devastated. There's no industry there. The shops have closed. The younger generation have moved out. Why? Because technology, economic change, the places haven't kept up. Those towns very often are dying to have immigrants, migrants come in because they are the ones that are revitalizing the economy of those towns. All you need in some hapless Middle West or upstate New York town of, let's say, 20,000 people, you just have, 10 Somali families move in. And pronto, you have shops opening, you have this happening, that happening, because the historical evidence has been throughout history, but it's very much true today, that the hardest working, most ambitious people are your migrants, your immigrants, whether they're refugees or not. Because they leave everything to make a better life for their children. They will do anything. They will clean motels, they will save. Everybody in the family works 2 jobs and in order to put their kids through school and to, then buy shops and so forth and so on. But that's not what it feels like if you're living in one of those barren towns and you can't imagine how you possibly who to blame. You want some kind of change. So I guess what I'm saying is, I believe what I'm saying is that in the U.S., as well as in other parts of the world, you have a sea change. a new international dynamic in the 21st century. And oddly, for the US, it's more of a sea change than it's in other parts of the world. Because for some reason, primarily because we've been in charge, we were the big power, and our sort of collective arrogance about our superiority led us to believe that we didn't have to, worry about these things because historically they've taken care of themselves. And along comes, a, what shall I call them, authoritarian leader, proto-fascist, I don't know. But we can't blame it all on Trump because most of the members of Congress buy into it. And I would submit to you, though I'll talk more about next time, that unless Congress wakes up, nothing is going to get better, right? We have, at some point, unless Congress weighs in and ceases supporting that. Did this all start with Trump? No. Was there an evolution? Will historians be able to say this all sort of started in the late 1990s or early 21st century? I have no idea. I mean, I can make an argument, but it's neither here nor there. But we now know that there is a sea change because based on the last few months, perhaps the last few years, what we now have is a situation where a major power has to recognize and does recognize that it's in decline. It's in decline not just because of its own malfeasance, but it's in decline because others have risen. For example, China. Okay. And one of the historical facts that every ancient historian will point, nowadays it's thrown around as the Thucydides factor because the Greek historian Thucydides wrote about this, is if you have the decline of one power and the rise of another power, you typically have a war. Because, for obvious reasons, right? Now, if we're going to have a war or not, I can't say, and we can talk about that. But in any event, we have a situation where you have all this other stuff I just talked about for half an hour. And on top of it, meantime, back at the farm, you have the rise of China. So you have the rise of China, you have the rise of technology, all right? And then you have, over here in this corner, you have Russia, which used to be a power and doesn't like the fact that it was diminished as a power. And I suppose if you're a Russophile or you talk to Peter Kines, he will say to you, Russia was really mistreated very badly. That is to say, we didn't recognize the psychological impact of the decline of the Soviet Union and what the demise of the Soviet Union would do to Russia and some of its neighboring countries and so forth. And therefore, not surprisingly, they're acting up. They also happen to have a dictator who is a nasty piece of work. But quite aside from that, around the margins of Russian policy can be seen Russian nationalism. And Russian nationalism, of course, can lead to lots of trouble, right? So you have all of this stuff I'm talking about in the West. You have China over there, right? And you have Russia and the former Soviet Union's republics and so forth, also having their own difficulties and acting up in one fashion or another. The bottom line of that is that the world is in a remarkable mess. Erosion of international institutions, technology, weapons here and there, huge amounts of weapons, economies that are destabilized, not just through bad economic policy, but also because economies are changing, technology is changing, and you have a power rising, a power in decline, and another power feeling that they've been, mistreated and so forth. And you have something else. You have, historically, I cannot explain this to you, you have a global lack of leadership. many countries in the world happen to have mediocre leaders. And here, I think it's worth saying something about, just briefly about Obama, which is that Obama, I think historically, will go down as a very good president in most ways. But one of the things that Obama was bad at was getting sort of out of himself and communicating sort of Roosevelt fireside chat type things. And so rather than explaining the world to people, explaining what he was doing and so forth, he just assumed fellow intelligent people would understand it, and they didn't. And Obama was in a position of having to counter the Bush years, because what Bush was doing was also very harmful, which was intervening in places, Iraq, for example, Afghanistan, which destabilized the whole corner of the world, and we're still paying the price, and we may be paying the price for many years to come. That was not Obama's fault. Obama smartly decided not to get in the middle of all of that in some ways. That, of course, made it worse in some ways, and one can argue about whether we should or shouldn't have gotten involved. But no matter where you come down on that side, he was dealt a very big bad hand in terms of the Middle East, and would have had a very hard time figuring out what in the world to do about that. So you have the Middle East, and you have that mess, and you have in Europe, by and large, mediocre leadership of one kind or another. And you have a KGB authoritarian in Russia. You have a strong leader in China, but a leader who is operating on shaky ground and has to mind his P's and Q's at home. And you don't really have, if you look around the world, just think about it. Is there anybody who speaks or writes frequently that you think, well, now there is a person who's got some ideas? There is, yes, Joe. Well, I'll talk about Merkel in a minute. Merkel is let me back up. I'll talk about her in a minute. There's essentially no one out there who has a world stage that people in different situations can listen to and care about. Merkel is a very good head of the German government, and she's exercised pretty good leadership in Europe, but she has no currency outside of Europe. And furthermore, she's a very conservative person. She doesn't try to address issues larger than the ones that she needs to address with. So I don't buy Merkel as a global leader. At best, she is a local leader. And Merkel, as you probably all know, is in deep difficulty herself with populism. So she'll probably win, but she's weakened, and seriously weakened. The other problem is, and we've discussed this before, is the fact that part of European institutions was based on controlling Germany. And it's ironic that Germany is the most viable, strongest country again in Europe. No one in Europe likes this much. And that undercuts, to some extent, her leadership. She can preach all she wants to France, but France is not happy to listen to Merkel. She can preach all she wants to Scandinavia, and they say, well, they respect her because she's stable. So the strongest case one can make for Merkel is that she has produced stability. And she's been very conservative about moving the EU forward in the direction that it needed to move and so forth. So I would sustain, I'm happy to argue with the rest of you, I'm happy to sustain the idea that at a time when people need to be out there to make sense of the world, this incredibly complex moving world, which is more dangerous than it ever has been historically, and we'll talk about North Korea and all that in a minute, is kind of leaderless. Okay. Along comes Trump. He's going to make America first again. He's going to exercise leadership. And it's very attractive. It looks like somebody is waiting in there, and he will make decisions. The problem, of course, is that the decisions he's making and what he stands for, right? But you can understand that if you are living in Felton, which has, I think, any of you live in Felton, has quite a lot of Trump supporters, right, in Felton? But it's not true. Okay. All right. I stand corrected. It's unfair. But if you live, let's say you live in those red states, in those small communities in those red states, right? Finally, somebody is talking to you, and the person sounds sensible. And when he doesn't sound sensible, people say in polls they don't care because he's a man of action. He's going to take action. Ironically, on that particular note, if we were any other country in the world during a different presidential regime and looking at a country like ours, we would probably be thinking there's a military takeover of that government. And ironically, not only is that descriptively look like that, the most powerful positions in security and so forth are all military people, but in point of fact, for those of us who've never been particularly fond of military thought or leaders or whatever, the best educated, smartest, and most reliable people in the Trump regime at the moment are the military. If anybody would have said that to you 20 years ago, you would have said they were cuckoo, right? But that's what we've come to. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with something that Trump describes as a mess. It is a mess. He's absolutely right about it. Of course, his solutions to the mess one can want to criticize, but it is a mess. And the other thing is that the New York Times, I think, had an article yesterday or the day before which says we're all benumbed by all of this. That is to say, so much is coming down every day that it's little hard to see where things are going and what is happening out there. We're in turmoil. The world is in chaos at some levels. Things are dysfunctional. And the global order is in disarray. And I would submit to you the fact that the global order is in disarray is probably, internationally at least, the most serious aspect of what we're dealing with. Because we are living in a highly weaponized world. We're living in a world where terrorism is rife. Now, here I want to say it is not true that there's more terrorism now than there's ever been in recorded times. Terrorism has always existed. Very often, it's limited itself to internal to a country. And when it hasn't, we typically didn't know about it, right? So it's not that thousands of people are dying and terrorism is all over the place. It's the fact that we hear about it on the news every night and we imagine, it's far more out of control than it actually is. It is also the case that if one imagines terrorism as ISIS or equates it with ISIS, that's a big mistake, because if ISIS disappears tomorrow, you're still going to have terrorism every which way. And particularly in countries that are tightening up, that are not allowing people any kind of political outlets, people who feel alienated for one reason or another. So terrorism is with us and will be for a long time. The trouble is that because the global order is in disarray, it's so much harder to deal with terrorism. Because quietly, unbeknownst to us on a daily basis, all the various police and anti-terrorism forces and so forth in all the countries are communicating as rapidly as we're going on our cell phones to say what the latest news is, right? But for that, you need a lot of cooperation. If you are alienated from another government, for example, if you keep insulting Germany or keep insulting England, they're going to stop sharing information, right? So we were dependent to keep this thing under some control, because people can move so fast and information can move so fast by having a global order. So the fraying of the global order is very serious business indeed. And I'm talking about the global political order and the global institutional order. Now then, one thing I haven't mentioned is the global economic order, right? I mentioned it to some extent with the EU, which was also an economic mechanism. But there's that wider world out there, and there is not just China, but India and other countries who are major global economic actors. I know many of you are on the other side of this issue, but I will say it anyway, and then you can help me. The idea that both the populism on the left and the right argued against the trade pacts and has essentially gotten rid of them. It's one of the most will, I think, historically be seen as one of the most serious fallacies of our current times. Because while it is true that trade pacts disadvantage people here and there, have not always had the tightest environmental regulations and so forth, I am not arguing in favor of some perfect trade pact that I've seen out there. Trade pacts need to be improved and so forth. Nor am I arguing that trade pacts don't have dislocations in individual countries. But tying countries together economically is one of the strongest leverage points of tying them together politically and in terms of cooperative enterprises. Bernie Sanders, as much as some of you loved him, did a lot of harm, not just by getting liberals and progressives to feel that he was against it and to support him because he was against it, but by making Clinton also be against it and the mainstream Democratic be against it. A big disaster for the West, a big disaster for the United States, I think, in the long run. I'm just predicting this, sort of. Well, why is it such a big disaster? I mean, we're the most powerful economy. China may overtake us, but anyway, here we are. So why do we care? Well, because the Economic Trade Pact, especially TPP, which integrated Asia and Latin America and us and so forth, was a way of the U.S. having a foot in the door of influencing Asia. China, if you recall, was not part of the TPP, though it's reasonable to assume had it come into being, sooner or later China would have joined. In the absence of the U.S. TPP proposal, or in the presence of it failing, what China is doing is filling the vacuum. That is to say, it is networking and knitting up trade pacts with all of those Southeast Asian countries. China is also the most active external power in Latin America and in Africa. So China is taking advantage of our sort of self-serving nonsense about all of this. And this is not good politically for those people who believe in liberal democracy and who believe in, whatever, human rights, fair trade, environment, and so forth. So China has become the leader in those parts of the world, and they jumped in immediately after TPP was knocked out. And they could see the writing on the wall because it wouldn't matter whether Trump or Hillary became president. They had both agreed that they were going to get rid of TPP. The other counterproductive global element, which I spoke about before, is climate and the climate agreement. There's a way for the U.S. to have influence. It was a way for countries, many of whom in the world see the problem. You might have noticed in the newspaper recently that the pollution problem in India is now almost worse than it's in China, and they have done less about it and are capable of doing less about it. And climate change will change everybody's lives, not just because we don't like the rain in Santa Cruz, but because it will fundamentally move people around, change economies, and so forth. So we have given, by contributing to the global disarray on climate change, by electing Trump, and Trump saying it's all phony baloney, and there's interesting stuff happened in the last couple of days on this, but we can go into that later, we have contributed to removing the potential of addressing climate change on a global interdependent level, right? So trade, climate change are two of the things where the chickens are going to come home to roost. And Europe realizes this. They're scared to death. Many small countries realize this, and we seem to be the dominant actor that doesn't realize this. And I think when the history of the 21st century is written, the erosion of the global order, and specifically focused on climate and trade, and the movement of people, that's the third one, will be, what will fundamentally change the quality of everybody's life. So instead of being able to cheer you up, I actually think it's going to get worse. Now, it may not get worse in the US, depending on what happens in American politics, but let's imagine that in 4 years' time or 8 years' time, most of the American public will wake up to the nightmare that is the Trump regime. It will take at least a decade to put things back, and some things can't be put back. That is to say, you can't tell China to go back home once they've made all those alliances. You can't put the ice back, the ice that's melting. You can't, tell the folks whose coastal towns have washed away that you will, send them back there. So some of these things, some things can be remedied. I mean, you can have better immigration laws, or you could do this or the other thing. But on some things, there's no way back very easily. So, and insofar as anybody would, be willing to reconstruct something, it will take at least a decade, maybe more, and you can't really reconstruct it. You just can try to remold it in some fashion. So, without talking about Korea as yet, or the Middle East, or Latin America, or Africa, or arms, or cyber, what I try to do, a little bit, but not a lot, what I try to do is just sort of lay out the scenery out there for a moment, and just sort of much of what I said, most of you already know, but it's just a way of sort of knitting it together a little bit and playing around with it a little bit. My attempt after the break, I'm perfectly willing to address very specific questions about anything, so you don't have to stay at this plane. And as I said, next time I will, go in detail into specific issues, because on the one hand, I'm making the case that these are kind of global questions where you can't put the genie back in the bottle. On the other hand, of course, it's not the case that Santa Cruz as Santa Cruz, California as California, the United States as the United States can't have better policies which chip away of the disaster that lies out there, right? So, for example, if the global climate change is not going to be implemented by the United States, let's say, we get out of it or whatever, that does not mean other countries, China, India, whatever, can't do something about climate change. It is not the case that simply because the U.S. EPA is in the hands of an anti-climate change person, that we in Santa Cruz can't do the best we can do in our local community, in our coastline, and so forth. So I'm not really saying local action, whether it's very local or whether it's national, is useless. I'm just saying that, and therefore we need to talk about specific policies. But I am saying that these larger issues are now globalized, and they have different impacts in different countries on different subjects, but they have repeating itself, fundamentally eroded the international order which we had built for 50 years and which we had gotten used to existing. And we used to discuss policies within that order or the malfunction of a particular order. But what I'm proposing now is that it's far worse than that. Namely, essentially, the order that was created has frayed so badly that at the moment it is not functioning. And on that cheerful note, take a break. So let me add one thing before I turn to you. And a couple of people raised this question. The one thing that is been running parallel to everything I've talked about is, of course, the nature of contemporary capitalism and the incredible inequalities it has created around the world. Not only inequalities among states, but also inequalities within states. And here, too, the fact that we so quickly know what goes on in the world is a factor, because we know how much money these billionaires make and how the rich people live compared to everybody else. And so that's been a key factor in the populism everywhere, is I'm stuck in my situation, nothing seems to have gotten better, and there are all these rich people. I think I mentioned last time 85 people in the world own half of all the well-being of the world, or economic well-being. I mean, it's extraordinary. And that, of course, is something that has to be acted upon both internationally and nationally. So that's a really important factor. And as a visitor from Ohio pointed out, all these people who voted for Trump in Ohio say to themselves, listen, I'm no better off, my salary hasn't gone up, and so forth and so on. I want change, and there comes somebody who promises change. So that's a really important factor, both nationally and internationally. I do want to put one asterisk to that, and that is that let's say I say to myself, gee, I haven't gotten a salary increase in 10 years or 5 years, and I'm really hostile about all of that. Part of the hostility is, of course, also media-driven. I might actually live okay. I have enough to eat. I have enough clothing. I'm not impoverished like, poor countries are. But I just like the idea, which has been an American idea through history, that things keep getting better and better. And I don't see things getting better and better. And that's psychological and not just economic. There is an economic component. Lots of people really are suffering. People are homeless. People, can't afford the education for their children. But I just want to submit, especially for the middle class, and a lot of middle class people also are populists, right, left, and center, that there is a TV media-driven psychological component, and that's often not talked about. I am a faculty up on campus, and my salary is $70,000, and then I see that the new vice chancellor gets a salary of $350,000. As you know, I wrote a letter about that. And that gets me angry. It's not that I'm suffering on my $70,000. I have an okay life. Maybe I'd like to take more vacations, have a better car, and the rest of it. So part of it is the constant vision of other people doing so much better, and not just that objectively most Americans are suffering that much. There are Americans who are suffering very badly, but compared to world standards, by and large, it's not quite as bad as we think in our heads for the middle class anyway. I just want to get that off my chest. All right, folks, questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it is a very good point. You all heard it, right? The media and all the misinformation. You constantly are getting misinformation. Trump generates misinformation. Facts are generated in anybody's head, and they become a fact. And the media that tries to be factual gets attacked. It's contemporary technology, modernity, the speed with things. People, don't check. Most of the people who get their news don't get their news from the Washington Post and the New York Times and the respectable journals. They get it from Fox News. I invite all of you who are not Fox watchers to watch it, because you get an idea as to why your fellow Americans think the way they do. It's very worthwhile. I am not saying you should spend the whole evening, but when something happens, listen here and there, half an hour, and you can see. How you change that, I have no idea, other than responsible people keep speaking up and saying, this is not the way it is. What you don't want is censorship, of course, because that's another one. Both the misinformation people as the people who want right information may say, okay, and therefore let's have censorship. So we are better off battling this out in public than having some form of censorship. Now we're coming close to that because Obama administration, or in fact Mrs. Obama and her lawyer, are trying hard to shut down newspapers and so forth. Huh? I mean, sorry, totally Trump. Yes, I'm totally unreliable. Let me tell you. Yeah, misinformation. That Mrs. Trump, his lawyer is suing these newspapers and trying to shut them down and so forth. So it's actually the potential for censorship is very scary here. And so I think that's has to be our highest concern. Well, the thing is, on many things one can have different beliefs, religious beliefs, different this and that. On proven, demonstrated, supportive facts, you can't just have a belief. I can't just believe that the street out here is not called High Street. I mean, I can tell you it's not High Street, but you can't do that. And there is a new folderol about climate change that is, if you read, I think the business page of the New York Times, there is a disgruntled scientist in one of the labs who's trying to get even with his bosses, and he says that all the research on climate change that that particular research place did was all faulty and was messed around with and so forth and isn't factual and so forth. So that has to now be, undone and demonstrated that their scientific experiments were in fact valid and so forth. People can make mistakes and sometimes facts can be disproven, but you can't just keep arguing that your facts are as good as mine. I can't, you can just say this street is called High Street and your claim that it's not called High Street is just inaccurate. Opinions are one thing, facts can be another, especially when they're scientific facts or census information or whatever. Errors can be made, they can be attacked, they can be corrected. But this thing is that anything anybody says is as good as anybody else. We just should not buy into. Yes, ma'am. Well, yeah, is the chaos a targeted, chaos that people are creating in order to mess with our heads, as they would say on campus? Maybe. But I would also submit to you that a presidential regime that we have now, which has essentially no staff that any institution is staffed with. Half the State Department heads are gone. All the various heads of national security are gone. Most of the agencies, the subheads of different units have been let go or been removed or have quit and so forth. There is very little there right now in the government, which of course means that anybody can make trouble of any kind that they want. If 6 months from now or a year from now, it looks as messy as it looks right now, maybe. But I think that the evidence is too weak right now. And don't forget, we have a president who doesn't read, who has no information, who doesn't want to, even when the National Security Council presents it with something, he wants a summary of 2 sentences. That is to say, most of what he says is what he thought about as he got up in the morning or goes to sleep at night when he tweets, right? So that kind of chaos is less calculated than resides in him. Whether these military people can bring some order into some of it, we'll have to see. But it's at least an interesting question. Yes, ma'am. Yes, you heard it, right? It has to do with there's so many conflicts of interest that some of these people have, Trump and so forth, and nobody seems to be doing much about it. It depends on the exact conflict. Some of it needs to be dealt with by Congress, and Congress is in the hands of Republicans who, at the moment, do not want to do anything against the administration. I think the only way that part, the Congress part, is going to change is when the Congress people decide that their political future is at risk if they keep going the way they are, which is why these demonstrations in Congress and senators' offices and so forth makes a lot of sense. They need to feel the pressure to finally get around to saying we need to do something about it. Other things are, potential for going into the legal system without congressional hearings. And there are lawyers in our midst who can tell me that I'm wrong, but I think there are two things. One, if the government were to bring charges, it would have to come through the Justice Department, and therefore Sessions is not about to do anything. So it would have to be lawsuits that are filed by individuals that have some kind of claim. And as good overall as the court system may be, it's also very slow. And given all the judicial appointments that were failed to be approved by during the Obama administration, you have a lot of vacancies in the legal system. So, for example, in Brooklyn, it takes 2 or 3 years until your case gets heard because they're so understaffed, right? So I don't think that's a very quick fix, but in due course, some of these things will wind themselves through the system. But I think the first step to be taken on some of these political issues, which are conflicts, would be Congress, and they're not budging at the moment. You have that here, yeah. Yeah, I certainly think things are at risk. The Greece is just in the process of getting rescued again. The IMF and the EU, I think, will reach agreement and it'll keep Greece in. The problem for Greece and some other countries is that you really need a monetary union. Without a monetary union, this stuff can't keep going the way it is, right? And unless the European members of the EU are willing to take that next step, the European Bank and Draghi is doing a pretty good job, but it's not the same as having monetary union. One of the things that might happen, that's not the worst case scenario, but close to it, may be that countries will not want to drop out of the EU, but will drop out of the euro. So unless something happens on the monetary side, you may see a fraying of the euro as a single currency. Because if you have your own currency, you can, through monetary and fiscal policy, adjust your economy, which you now can't, right? Yeah, right. So that might be a step. Whether the EU will fray in general has a lot to do with who gets elected in some of these elections. Because if, for example, Le Pen gets elected, she will want out of the EU, right? So that's hard to predict. It depends on to what extent the center can hold. Now, the center holding, by the way, has a lot to do with the fact that these elections in Europe are being interfered with by the Russians as well. So, for example, the Russians are now attacking the centrist French candidate, and they're messing around in the German election and so forth. If you want to be cynical about that, and some people are, especially people who want to defend Russia, you can say, well, the U.S. has also messed with people's election. And that's actually true, but not to this extent. And less effectively, let's put it that way. That is to say, you can argue that the U.S. messed in the Ukrainian election. You can argue, some others. But even under the best case scenario, the U.S. has not either expended the money or the technology to do what they're doing right now. Yes, ma'am, back there. Yeah. Well, yes, that's a good question. I mean, populism essentially says, I speak for the people, the real people, right? And that can be a subgroup in your country, right? So I'm speaking for the real people in England, right? Says Farage. As compared to nationalism, which says my country is better than your country, which writ large, or my ethnic group is better than your ethnic group in terms of ethnic nationalism, right? So the whoever the real people are might be a particular economic group, or might be a local group of some kind, and so populism really is sometimes is nationalistic, but doesn't have to be nationalistic. Yes. Well, it certainly can happen, but that means that every branch of government rolls over. And there's no reason to believe at the moment that the courts will roll over. The fact that you have both the houses of Congress and the president on the same party has happened before. And typically in the next election, you have more variation on the theme. Well, that's true, not with someone like him. So the question is, what will he and his administration be able to do? I mean, it's easy. You can be very conservative without being anti-democratic, right? And there are lots of people who supported Trump who were not anti-democratic or populist even, but simply were conservative and didn't like some of the policies of Obama, which is, in our system, you don't have to like all the policies of a particular party. So could it happen? Yes, of course it could happen. And one of the most optimistic part, I think, about the United States is that we're much less, it's much difficult to rule us. We're much more unruly than many people in the world. Many people in the world are not as quick to rise up, to demonstrate, to do things, to get fed up, to ask for change, and so forth. And I think that to some extent, all these demonstrations, the sort of instant demonstrations at the airport, the organizing in Santa Cruz for the refugees and illegals and so forth, that's, so far at least in the U.S., has held us in good stead. And I think that's what we have to count on, that there are enough, after all, the majority of people didn't vote for Trump, and even that some of the people who voted for Trump may change their mind over certain issues. So if one wants to be optimistic about the U.S., is to say that we're distinctly difficult to rule and distinctly difficult to fall in line, and we're a distinctly diverse country, both geographically and so forth, and one can only hope that that distinction will make itself manifest and rescue us from this. That's the most positive thing I can think of. Yeah. That's an interesting and complex question, actually, because the consequence for people fleeing countries can either be, massive rates of death, genocide of various sorts, can be great instability, which can lead to neighboring instability and war in various parts of the world. The fact that it is so easy to move around the world nowadays. I mean, it's a lot. You can very quickly move from the Middle East to some other place in the Middle East or to Europe or whatever. That will tax the values of almost all democracies and all signatories to things like human rights conventions and genocide conventions and so forth. Because when the boats arrive, let's say, or people swim or whatever, if you say let them drown, you're violating all kinds of things which you come to believe in for 50 years, 60, 70 years, right? So that fundamentally would mean a change in the values and the belief systems of democracies, of Western societies, and so forth. So that would be the first thing. There is an economic side to it, and that is that almost all industrial countries are and by that I'm also going to include China, are aging out. That is to say, the population is getting older and older, and they actually need workers from other societies to keep their economies going. Now, some countries are pretending that that's not the case, but it will soon become the case. I mean, Japan can continue to operate without allowing non-Japanese people to come in and giving them a reasonable life and perhaps residency and all the rest of it. China in the next decade will have to import labor. The U.S. has a younger demographic than most industrial countries, primarily because of immigration, not refugees, but immigration. And unless we, continue to allow people in, the American economy will suffer because there are already pockets where our American economy is dependent on foreign labor. And not just at the pick the letters in the field level, at the higher levels. For example, somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 American doctors in rural America are migrants from other countries. We are going to decimate the supply of medical care, never mind medical insurance, medical care, if we don't allow those people in. Half of Silicon Valley was born somewhere else. Half the startups or more come from somewhere else. So that the American economy, where sort of in Trump world, there are all these criminals and lowlifes coming across the border. In fact, two things. The unskilled labor is absolutely essential to the American economy. The high school dropout gang members from Detroit or Chicago are not about to pick letters in the valley. And in any event, people can't move there because the rent is too expensive, etc. So that's the first thing. And at the so we need labor at levels where U.S. American citizens are unwilling to work, right? And then at the top reaches, we need the doctors, the engineers, the entrepreneurs, and so forth. So were we to literally close the border, within a decade, the U.S. would seriously suffer in its own economy. Perhaps not as quickly and as much throughout the economy. Sectors would suffer, but not throughout the economy, as some other countries. So unless the world gets its brain around the idea that people are going to have to move for the economic well-being of the world, considering how long we're all living, right, and how few children we're all having. I mean, there are almost many industrial countries in Europe, in Asia, Korea, Japan, China. People don't want more than one child. They don't want to have to pay the cost of educating one, which means non-replacement, right? You have to have at least 2 children per 2 people in order to replace the population. And what I'm saying is, and I'm stringing it out too much, there's a huge demographic issue if we don't keep borders open. Now, some border control always makes sense. You can't just overwhelm a country that they can't support people with housing, with roads, with the rest. But boy, you better keep the borders open in this 21st century, otherwise you're going to be in real difficulty. Yes? Our business is retreating from globalization, and that, of course, means, is Trump right? They can all come back and don't have to be overseas. Well, I am of the persuasion that even when businesses come back for whatever reason, tax, other reasons, that is not going to lead to the employment that people in these towns in Ohio or wherever, Michigan, anticipate. Because one of the things that's happening is that technology is changing the way production operates. So when they come back with fewer jobs and more technology, and the jobs require higher training and education because they'll have to work the computers that work the machinery, and they're not going to operate the machinery per person. The computers are going to operate it. So some jobs may come back to industrial countries as wages go up in countries. But even when jobs stay overseas and when production stays overseas, there is this sort of vague idea that, if a phone producers of phones or cars or whatever, they're either made here or there. In point of fact, most things are not made either here or there. Bits and pieces are made in different countries, which is, if you let them move around, lots of people work at different aspects of it, and then at some point they get put together somewhere, right? So if Trump makes good on his 20% of anything coming in from Mexico, it's not just that everybody who goes to Walmart will pay more for the stuff that's made in Mexico and imported, but it's much worse than that. It's a lot of American manufacturers who employ Americans here at home won't have the bits and pieces of whatever they do that are produced elsewhere, except through high cost of bringing them in, which also means they may either go out of business or they may follow a different business model. So it's actually incredibly complicated, and in general, it used to be thought that the only reason people move elsewhere has to do with the cost of labor. In fact, for most contemporary produced goods, it's not just the labor cost is only a percentage of the whole cost. It is transportation, it is environmental consideration, it's all these other things that put together the cost of an item, right? So if you have, for example, environmental standards in Vietnam, right, that will raise, never mind the cost of labor there, that will raise the cost of that item. So the complexity of it's not just a global trade question, it's a global production question. And production is incredibly complex nowadays as to how things are produced. So these simple rhetorical things that people mouth there about, you stop the trade and we bring all the factories back. Yes, these couple of corporations have told Trump they are not going to have something overseas or something. And at the end of the day, it meant maybe 150 jobs stay in the U.S. Well, those 150 jobs are a drop in the bucket. The real question is, how does industry work internationally nowadays? And it works internationally. Now, that I am not against all regulations. I'm not saying that worker rights, environmental stuff ought not to be taken into account. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not as simple as production is here or production is there. It's combines nowadays in a very complex. So in order to know exactly what's happening, you have to study a particular industry. And all these generalizations are just that. They're generalizations. They may apply to your industry, but not her industry in some way. Does that make sense to you? Yes, back there. Yeah. Sure, which is why not just the poor, downtrodden, unemployed workers in red states, but high-end people. Yeah, as you know, the stock market is, sky high, and people who have money in the stock market, if they're invested well, are making tons of money, and they're happy, and so forth. Well, two things, and I'm not an expert. There's somebody here who actually knows about this sort of thing. The first thing I think to be said is that most Americans don't have tons of stock. In fact, most Americans can't get through 1 year post-retirement on what they've saved in retirement. So that is a kind of a distinctive problem of a subclass of people. Second, I think most people think that there will be a collapse of all of this, and people might, in fact, lose a lot of their money, and then they're going to be, I don't know who they're going to blame on losing their money. So the stock market currently is riding high, and their economists can explain it in various ways, and that no doubt will influence your friend or acquaintance. But it's not what most people in most countries are wrestling with, because they don't have investments in the stock market, other than through their pensions, by and large not doing well, and through their 401s or whatever, 403s. Sometimes they're well invested, sometimes they're not, but by the time they take them out, the whole thing might have collapsed again. So I think it's sort of like a sugar high, I think. Jane, you want to comment? No, I'm not asking to give you general advice. Do you think what I said is vaguely accurate? Okay, because she knows more about the truth than I do. I think it's a temporary phenomenon, right? And I suppose if you've just made $80,000 and you want to upgrade your house to one that's worth $1.2 million or whatever, you can quickly do it. And then you say, well, I got a bigger house out of Trump. Which, by the way, is another one. Let me just connect it to something I talked about earlier. So Americans who are unhappy about their lot, right? I live in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, and I see all these people living in these $1 million houses, and I feel done in. Actually, our parents all lived in those houses, and they didn't feel done in. And part of it is psychological, of expectations. But expectations move into politics and how people think. Yes. Well, let me take the second question first. Pence is extremely conservative. His social values probably are not shared here, or by most of you. He is, in many ways, boring. He is a reasonably experienced congressperson and state official. He is not a space cadet and a crazy. He just has politics that most of you would disagree with. Would he support, or if he was on his own, would he be in favor of some of the things Trump says? Sure, because they would be his policies on health care, small government, all of those kinds of things. Would he be willing, as he already has, to listen to the generals and say, you better reassure the Europeans on Nato and those kinds of things? Probably. That is to say, at some levels, he's a Republican company man, as distinct from a kind of, dare I say, nutcase, space cadet, whatever that we have. So would you consider that better? Probably less dangerous, and probably in terms of he's not going to tweet in the middle of the night, but probably also many of us would disagree with the policies he put forward. But then, you have to say elections go one way or the other. You sometimes agree with presidents, you sometimes don't. I don't think his persona and his background suggests that he wishes to be destructive for the sake of being destructive. he wishes to pursue his policies, which are very conservative. So whether that's better or for worse. Impeachment, don't forget that the Senate has to vote, and the Republicans would probably not be prepared to impeach him at this point. So that's not an immediate option. Would it be an option down the line? I can't guess. Yes, no. I'm not going to comment on that. Back there. Yeah, the concerns are, hate and hate crimes and a sort of level of hate. And also, what about the media? Can these big corporations that control the media, and the Trump people have already linked with Time Warner and, that sort of, huh? Well, Rupert anyway, but that wouldn't be a change in the case of Rupert, right? But Time Warner, coming down on all the things, all the media that Time Warner controls would be a change. The best inoculation against all this hate stuff is for everybody to rise up. We are socialized into doing that as Americans. We can do it. We should do it. We should resist it. It's up to everybody else to resist it. Have there always been people to do hate things? Sure. Look at, the South. Look at it before... whatever. And look at the hate crimes that have gone on throughout our history. It's just that the majority of the people have to resist. And there are times in which everything seems sort of vaguely normal. I mean, there are bad things going on here and there, but it doesn't hit us in the face. And we sort of sit back and say, well, whatever. Every now and then there's a teenager that does something, or anybody, or an innocent person gets shot because of their race and so forth. But when it becomes a kind of major policy issue, and it gears up all the haters from everywhere, whether they're anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican, anti-Black, anti-whatever, then it's up to really Americans who normally are capable of organizing themselves and getting involved. And I think that the best inoculation against all of this really is, at the end of the day, for Americans, to whatever organizations they belong to or meetings or whatever, to say no. Because this is a minority, it's an active minority, it's a minority that now feels itself empowered. And if they're empowered, we have to empower ourselves. And, and get our kids and grandkids and everybody to say, look, this is not an acceptable thing, and you got to get involved and resist. Will it succeed? I don't know. But one has to try. Right. And there are all these analogies to fascism and Hitler and Mussolini and so forth. And sometimes they're valid and sometimes they're not valid. But the strongest thing I can say for the U.S. and us in this case is we're not Germans, we're not Italians. And we're not the societies that were socialized into rolling over and not being active. I mean, we get up on our high horses when there's a street light that's not working, for heaven's sake, right? Our crosswalk is in the wrong place. And we go to hearings and meetings and so forth. And that's good, but that means we're socialized to be able to do that, and we've got to do it in these cases, is what I would say, too. Oh, the media question. Well, I have no answer. I don't know. I don't know to what extent these executives will roll over. I think that, the funds for PBS will probably be cut, which that means that all those people making all this money in the stock market ought to contribute to PBS to keep it going. They're going to cut the endowment for the arts and humanities probably, unless people really stand up and try to prevent it. I think that some of the networks will continue and resist, and some will probably fold. And there again, they're not just part of a corporation, they're dependent on advertisers. And when people get angry at the advertisers for supporting things, I'm not going to brush my teeth with Colgate toothpaste if Colgate doesn't speak up, that sort of thing. So even there, some resistance is possible. But how successful it will be, I don't know. Yes, yes. Well, I want to talk not a lot, but some about North Korea next time. But let me just say that the North Koreans, sent up this missile. It's not the first time, by the way, they've sent up lots of missiles. It's just they wanted to put down a marker after Trump became elected. The North Koreans are really very dangerous. The various policies to make them less dangerous haven't worked under both Republicans and Democrats. And a lot of negotiation needs to be engaged in with the Chinese. And there are things that we haven't done as yet that can be done to put some leverage on the North Koreans. The Chinese, by the way, have exercised a little leverage after the thing. They cut the coal imports, which was, it doesn't sound major, but for North Korea, since it's one of the main exports, that was not unimportant. So the Chinese and the Americans, to some extent, have a joint interest there. What they don't have a joint interest in is that the Chinese do not want to make South Korea a permanent thing. And so there's some area for give and take where South Korea and North Korea fit in and so forth. So some imaginative diplomacy could probably do something. But there again, you're dealing with a crazy, right? So if you imagine Trump and then the North Korean leader, it's very easy for accidents to happen, and also for him to get it in his mind as soon as he has. They don't have a nuclear head as yet; they just have the long-range missile. The nuclear heads have to be small enough to fit on the missile. So once they have that, they really can hit us. And the problem is, even if you imagine that we could shoot it down, right? By that particular point, North Korea can kill millions and millions of people in South Korea, right? So what kind of a bloodbath will this all be? And so the Trump administration saying, well, we're big boys here, we'll take charge, that could become very dangerous. The bright side of the Korea business, it has nothing to do with Korea, but has to do with all these military types in our government. Because believe it or not, the military doesn't like conflict. They really don't like to have their people die, and they don't like to have to send them anywhere and so forth. So probably the military would stop the worst, something that Trump thinks up in the middle of the night. But on the other hand, we have no control of what the North Koreans think up in the middle of the night. So it is very dangerous. But, yes. I think it's a good question, but there's a fundamental difference, and that is that it was easy not to know the details of the internment if you lived in, God knows, some other part of the country. Nowadays, one would immediately learn these things. As you probably know, the Trump people have said they're going to set up, 10 new detention centers and this, that, and the other thing. Well, what goes on in them will leak out and will get into the media, right? So while it's true that it's a very black mark against our history about that internment, I'm also thinking that the communications situation nowadays is sufficiently different that more people would know on an hour-by-hour basis what's going on. And there again, people could offer some resistance. Not necessarily successful. I'm not saying bad things aren't going to happen. All I'm saying is the historical time is so different and the technology and media is so different that it's hard to hide anything nowadays. Right? Just like we know what's going on in, more or less in Guantanamo, right? We learned that. We'll learn it again. And, Trump can scream bloody murder against all these leaks. But the less people believe in what's going on and what they're being asked to do, the more leaks there will be. And once there is a leak, we all hear about it within an hour, right? Friends, we need to wrap this up. As I said, next time I'll be happy to talk about, and I will start talking about specific policies here, there, and yonder, and bring additional questions. And I'm sorry I couldn't find a way to cheer you up. I apologize.